Okay, let's look at Unit 2, Colonialism and Papua New Guinea. So the first unit, we were introduced to the framework of colonialism. So now we know the frameworks are in the driving forces. There are three driving forces: colonialism itself, which talks about the spreading of beliefs and ideas by developed nations to the underdeveloped nations. And then political dimension, which talks about establishment of important political structures, and economy dimension, which talks about introducing, or colonialism introducing, the idea of cash economy. So in Unit 2, I believe we are going to expand a little bit on those concepts. Let's start by looking at our objectives here. So at the end of this unit, you must be able to evaluate the effects of colonialism in Papua New Guinea. Now, you can, in order to help you understand, underline and highlight this word evaluate. And then you search up the meaning, okay, the dictionary, or the meaning of evaluate. What does it mean by to say evaluate? Number 2, explain the social, economic, and political effects of colonialism in Papua New Guinea. So explain is the key word there. You have to explain. Explain what? You ask yourself questions like this. What am I going to explain? Secondly, I'm going to explain the social, economic, and political effects. So you have to explain three things. You have to explain social, political, economic, their effects. Number 3 objective is analyze. Ask yourself again, what am I going to analyze? You are going to analyze the historical perspective, the history of colonialism and its evaluation. So it's a fancy way of saying that you are going to analyze the story of colonialism in Papua New Guinea. So by the end of this unit, you should be able to analyze the history of or story of colonialism in Papua New Guinea. You are going to explain social, political, and economic effects in Papua New Guinea, and you are going to evaluate generally the effects of colonialism in Papua New Guinea overall. By looking at those objectives, let's go straight to page 5. So you ask yourself like this, if I'm going to, one more thing, in order to study those study notes, you have to engage with those study notes. Okay? Don't think that when you ask yourself and talk to yourself, you are going to be mental or long or something like that. If you think like that, you won't learn and understand. You have to interact with the notes, study notes. It's not only these notes, but other notes as well. If you're reading text, if you're reading important documents, interact with the documents. So by asking questions with the study notes, it's only then you will understand and learn. Okay, let's try to apply this principle here. We go back to page 4 and see the first objective here. We are going to evaluate, so you skim. If you look at page 2, it talks about effects, so you start here. So how do we evaluate the effects of colonialism in Papua New Guinea? Let's read this paragraph here. You know, sometimes this paragraph here likes to be filled with very expensive words, but simply, okay, it's a very, it's just how textbooks are written. So when you interact with the paragraph here, you will find out that it's talking about very simple ideas and discussions to understand. But let's look at the effects, and I read, colonialism brought many types of changes to Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea were introduced to modern forms of political institutions, the production of goods for export, and modern education and health services, which many had not been exposed to prior to world wars. The second sentence is a very important sentence. Highlight this sentence here. So, the effects of colonialism. Colonialism brought with it the idea of political institutions. Because of colonialism, we now know that we need to vote for a member of parliament. We need to go for an election. All right, that is an example effect of political institutions. Secondly, we now know the value of money, and we need to harvest coffee, cocoa, copra, export it in exchange of money or cash. Because of colonialism, we now know that we need to get an education. Because of colonialism, we now know that we don't have to always depend on glassman or traditional herbs. There are scientifically proven medication to help improve and help our health. So basically, these are the effects of colonialism. So by doing that, we sort of achieve objective 1. So if you look further, for example, local government council, that is an example of colonialism. Colonialism established local government councils, and at the village level, we have the village councillors. Yes, we have the village presidents. These are some of the examples of the effects of colonialism. Because of colonialism, we have now plantations. We have coffee plantation in the highlands. Yes, we have a lot of coffee plantation in the highlands. Why do you need to plant coffee in the islands? Because you want to make money, right? You have cocoa plantations in the coastal regions. Why do you have cocoa plantation? Of course, you want to harvest cocoa and to sell it in exchange of the monetary value. Education and health services. Because of colonialism, we were introduced to the idea of having access to basic education is important for integral human development, which is one of the 5 goals and directive principles espoused in our constitution. So in itself here, objective 1, because of colonialism, we saw the establishment of a local government council. We see the plantation and agricultural development and establishment, and education and health services. Now let's look at the second objective. Here, explain social and economic and political effects of colonialism. So, let's see if there's any mention of political effects. I believe we've already talked about it. The effects of political effects of colonialism in itself is the introduction of the representative democratic system. Because without representative democracy, you wouldn't have the establishment of the local village council. Democracy, representative democracy, established the different levels of government: the central government, the provincial government, and the local government. And in the local government, you have the village council, the village wards, the presidents, all make up the political structures, or all make up, the government system. So I believe objective 2 is repetitive. It's the same as objective 1 and objective 2. The economic aspect would be, yes, we have already talked about it, the establishment of plantation. Now the social aspect, I think that is the one that we didn't talk about, and I don't think it's mentioned in detail here. The social aspect of it would be, let's say, why do we need to speak English? Use English in the institutions? When you graduate with your Bachelor of Arts degree, that certificate would be written in English. That is one example of a social effect. We like to measure ourselves as a modern Papua New Guinean by speaking in English. Now, if you speak in your own language, sometimes they'll call you Les Mausa, something like that. That's social effect of colonialism. We like to measure our success or our modern standard according to the clothes that we wear, the phones that we use, the kind of language that we speak, the boombox that we carry around, the type of music that we listen to. You don't like to listen to someone beating the garamut or kundu. You don't like music coming from the traditional form. You like the music that has beat, all right? That has a swag, something like that. So that's the social effects of colonialism. Third objective here, analyze Papua New Guinea in its historical perspective and thus understand the historical evolution. This third objective here, it's not mentioned in detail here. The historical perspective of colonialism, I think I've stated it earlier, but I'll state it again. 1884, Papua and New Guinea was not Papua and New Guinea. We were living in tribal and ethnic division, boundaries, scattered all over the place. When the Germans came and established plantation on New Guinea, that sort of saw a first contact. So the coastal regions had a first encounter with colonialism around 1884, not the islands region. Islands region was about the 1940s later. In, let's say, in the northern region, in the southern, the establishment of Australia and New Zealand as a British colony also had an impact on colonialism into the southern region. But again, we were never called Papua and New Guineans. We were living in a primitive era, primitive age. We have no sense of a nation. So 1884 came along, 1901. 1901 is when Australia became independent. And this is important because understanding Papua New Guinea politics is not enough if we don't understand the development and politics of Australia and New Zealand, especially Australia. When 1901 came, Australia got its independence, Britain had to relieve its Papua colony or territory to the ends of Australia. So Australia had to take on the extra burden of taking charge of Papua in 1906. After 1906, New Guinea territory was still under the German through the establishment of the German company. They call it the German New Guinea Company. It was a company, but not, it has no political institution or establishment, but the territory was run by the German company. So it's purely towards exploitation by the business or the enterprise. Not up until 1914 when the First War broke out, 1914 to 1918, and when the Germans was defeated, New Guinea territory was administered or given to Australia. After 1918 comes 1949. 1949 is important. Why is it important? 1949, for the first time, New Guinea or Papua and New Guinea came together as one, jointly as Papua and New Guinea territory, administered by one central government, and that is at Colonialism. So we were never a nation from, or never a state from 1884 to 1949. Up until 1949, we were living in isolation and in our tribal and ethnic lineages, not a state. By 1949, Papua New Guinea Territory Act came on board, which saw the unification of Papua New Guinea. 1951, the first political structure was created, and that is the 1951 Legislative Council. Legislative Council is important because through Legislative Council, various laws and acts are created. Now, 1964, the first House of Assembly was established. This is also important because this is where our people now were introduced to this idea of representative democracy. In 1964, our people now know that they have to vote for a representative to represent them on the floor of Parliament. 1968, second House of Assembly. Again, our people voted for representatives. 1972, the third House of Assembly. And then 1973, self-government came in. By 1973, our people were given mandate for self-government and to rule. And then 1975, we've got our independence. So that is, you can say, a timeline of Papua New Guinea as a state from 1884 to 1949, 1951, 1964, 68, 72, and 1973. All right. So that sort of concludes Unit 2, and we will continue on Unit 3 next week.